When my son found out I was moving to a small province in the Philippines, he didn't get angry. He just went quiet. That kind of quiet that's worse than yelling. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, looked down at his coffee, and finally said, "Dad, are you sure you're okay?" I was 63 years old, retired 11 months earlier from 31 years working maintenance at a municipal water department. My wife, Patricia, had passed away 2 years before that, and I was sitting there trying to explain to my son why I was about to sell most of what I owned, pack 2 bags, and fly to a country I had visited exactly once, for exactly 9 days, 3 years prior. My daughter, Renee, called me the next morning. She was more direct than her brother. "Pop, this isn't healthy. You're grieving. You're not thinking straight." She wasn't wrong to worry. I understood that. If one of my kids came to me with that same story, I'd probably say the same things. But here's what none of them understood. I wasn't running away from my grief. I wasn't chasing something exotic. I wasn't having some late-life crisis that needed to be managed or talked down. I was trying to solve a problem. A very specific, very practical problem that had been quietly getting worse for 2 years. And I want to tell you about that problem, because I suspect more people recognize it than are willing to say out loud. For most of my working life, I assumed retirement would feel like relief. I had done what you're supposed to do, worked steadily, put money into my 401(a), paid off the house eventually, didn't overspend. Patricia and I had lived modestly and saved when we could, and by the time I handed in my badge at the water department, we had enough to live on. Not lavishly, but enough. Then Patricia got sick, and then she was gone. And then I was retired, alone, in a 3-bedroom house in central Ohio, living on a modest pension and Social Security, and the numbers that had looked manageable when there were 2 of us suddenly looked very different with just 1. Property taxes hadn't changed. The house still needed its roof looked at. The car insurance, the utilities, the groceries, none of it adjusted because my circumstances had. And there's something nobody warns you about when you lose a spouse after 40 years. The cost of loneliness is real, and it shows up in strange places. You eat out more because cooking for one feels pointless. You leave the TV on just to have sound in the house. You find yourself calling the plumber for things you would have fixed yourself because you can't stand to spend a Saturday afternoon alone with a project and your thoughts. I wasn't broke. I want to be clear about that. But I also wasn't living the kind of retirement I had spent decades working toward. There were no trips, no dinners out without doing math in my head first. Every unexpected expense, and there was always an unexpected expense, felt like a small defeat. And then, about 14 months after Patricia passed, I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, going through bills. Nothing dramatic had happened, no emergency, just the regular stack of envelopes, and I caught myself thinking something I hadn't expected. I thought, this is it. This is what I worked for. And I sat there for a long time after that. That question didn't leave me. I started paying attention to it instead of pushing it away. I started researching, the way you do when you're 63, and have more time than you know what to do with. I watched videos, read forums, looked at other countries, and one kept coming up in a way that was hard to ignore. The Philippines. People talked about the cost of living, about English being widely spoken, about the warmth of the people. But one thing came up over and over that wasn't about money at all. Retirees kept saying they felt less alone there. At first, I thought that was just tourism brochure language. Later, I understood what they meant. That search eventually led me here. And over the past year and a half, living in a small city in the Visayas that most Americans have never heard of, I've learned things I didn't expect to learn at 63. Not just about the Philippines, about myself, about retirement, about what actually matters when you're finally done pretending to be too busy to think about it. There are 9 of them. 9 things that change the way I see almost everything. And the last one is the one that surprised me most. The first thing I learned was that the biggest risk isn't the one you can see. Before I left, everyone around me was focused on the risks of going. The heat, the unfamiliar medical system, the distance from family, the language, even though English is everywhere here. My son made a list, an actual written list, of things that could go wrong. I appreciated the love behind it. But nobody was making a list of what was already going wrong by staying. I had been in that house alone for over 2 years. I had watched my world shrink from something full of routine and structure and purpose to something very quiet and very small. The risks of that, the health risks, the cognitive risks, the emotional risks of long-term isolation, those weren't on anyone's list. They weren't dramatic enough to worry about. They happened too slowly to feel urgent. But slow erosion is still erosion. What I've come to believe is that risk looks different depending on which direction you're facing. When you're facing a change, the risks are vivid and specific. When you're facing the status quo, the risks are invisible because they're already familiar. That asymmetry kept me stuck for longer than it should have, and I think it keeps a lot of people stuck. The second thing I learned was about a kind of stress I didn't know I was carrying. I thought I understood stress. I had worked in municipal infrastructure for 3 decades. Burst mains, staff shortages, budget cuts. I knew what pressure felt like. But the stress I'm talking about is different. It's the background kind. The kind that doesn't spike. It just hums, constantly, underneath everything, until you stop hearing it because it becomes the baseline. I didn't know I was carrying it until it started to lift. About 2 months after I arrived, I was sitting outside in the early evening. My neighbor's kid was kicking a ball around in the street. Someone 2 houses down was cooking, and I could smell it from where I was sitting. A couple of older men were talking at the corner. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't running through a mental list of things I needed to handle. I was just sitting there, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Not the sitting outside part, the not running through a list part. Back in Ohio, even on my quietest days, there was always a low-level current of vigilance running through me. Waiting for the next expense, anticipating the next problem, mentally rehearsing scenarios that never happened. I thought that was just adult life. I thought it was what responsible people felt. It took leaving for me to understand that I had been living with my jaw clenched for years, and I hadn't noticed because I had no reference point for anything different. I'm not saying the Philippines cured me of stress. Life still happens here. Last month the scooter needed a repair I hadn't planned for. My landlord raised my rent a small amount. One of my back teeth started giving me trouble and I had to find a dentist. None of that disappeared, but the background hum is different now, and the difference, it turns out, is enormous. The third thing I learned was about what retirement actually takes from you, and it isn't money. Patricia and I used to have dinner with Jim and Colleen every few weeks. Just the 4 of us, rotating houses, nothing fancy. When Patricia passed, those dinners slowed down, then stopped. Not because Jim and Colleen were unkind, just because the shape of things had changed and nobody quite knew how to put it back together. By the time I retired, I was going days without a real conversation, sometimes a week. I told myself I didn't mind. I'm a fairly private person. I like my own company. But there's a line between solitude and isolation that I had crossed without noticing. Solitude is a choice. Isolation is what happens when choices quietly stop being made. What surprised me about living here was how hard it was to stay isolated even when I wasn't trying. Within the first 2 weeks, my landlord's wife had introduced me to 3 different neighbors. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Benny, started inviting me to join him and a few other men who met in the mornings to drink coffee near the market. Nothing formal, no invitation. I just started showing up and it became a thing. I hadn't had that in years. That low stakes, no agenda, just people being around each other kind of regularity. And I didn't know how much I had missed it until I had it again. The fourth thing I learned was that independence, the way Americans are taught to think about it, can quietly become a trap. I grew up being told that a man handles his own problems. You don't ask for help you don't need to ask for. You don't impose. You don't burden people. There's dignity in self-reliance, and I still believe that, but I took it further than I should have. After Patricia passed, I handled everything alone. All of it. The paperwork, the accounts, the house, the grief. Partly because I didn't want to lean on my kids more than necessary. Partly because I didn't know how to ask. Partly because somewhere along the way I had equated needing help with failing at something. Living here dismantled that slowly. There was an afternoon in my 3rd month when I was trying to figure out a utility registration issue. The kind of bureaucratic thing that should take 20 minutes and somehow takes 4 hours because nothing is where you expect it to be. I was sitting outside a government office looking lost, which I absolutely was. A woman who worked there, not in any official capacity for me, just a staff member on her break, came over and asked if I needed help. She spent 40 minutes walking me through the process, translating a form, pointing me toward the right window. She wouldn't hear of any payment. She acted as though helping me was simply what you did when someone needed help. I thought about that for days afterward. I had spent so long treating self-sufficiency as a virtue that I had made accepting help into something that felt like failure. But the woman who helped me didn't see it that way at all. She saw it the way I was starting to see the people around me see a lot of things, as something natural, as just part of how people take care of each other. I still handle my own problems, but I hold them less rigidly now. The 5th thing I learned was about time and how I had been spending mine without really choosing to. My whole working life ran on schedules. Clock in, clock out. Appointment at 2, meeting at 4. Even in retirement, I had transferred that structure to myself. Wake up, make coffee, pay attention to the news, run errands in the morning before it gets too hot. Everything had a slot. When I moved here, that structure didn't transfer. Things ran differently. A repairman told me he'd come by in the afternoon and arrived at 6:30 in the evening, calm as anything, as though this was the afternoon he had always meant. The first few times that happened, I was genuinely irritated. My American sense of time felt like a hard fact, and everything here felt like a violation of it. But over a few months, something softened in me. Not my sense of responsibility, not my standards, just my relationship with the clock. I started sitting outside in the mornings without a specific reason. I started letting conversations go longer than I had planned. I stopped checking the time every 20 minutes to make sure I was staying on schedule with a day that had no schedule. And I noticed something happening in those stretches of unstructured time. I started actually seeing things. The way the light changed in the late afternoon. The sound the rain made on the corrugated roof. A small dog that lived 3 houses down and visited my gate every morning looking hopeful. I had been in such a constant state of moving through my days that I had stopped experiencing them. Slowing down wasn't laziness. It was the first time in years I was actually present. The 6th thing I learned was that I had been chasing the wrong version of a good life. I spent most of my adult years believing more was better. Not in a greedy way. In an anxious way. More savings meant more security. More possessions meant more comfort. More options meant less fear, and I accumulated accordingly. By the time I sold the house in Ohio, I had a garage full of things I hadn't touched in a decade. A basement that held the physical evidence of 30 years of cautious accumulation. Getting rid of most of it was harder than I expected, but only at first. There was a weekend afternoon about 3 weeks before I left when I was in the garage sorting through things, deciding what to keep, what to sell, what to give away. I found a box of tools that had belonged to Patricia's father, kept those. I found a set of golf clubs I had bought in 1998 and used maybe 12 times. Let those go. And at some point in that process, something shifted. The things stopped feeling like possessions and started feeling like weight. I arrived here with 2 bags. My apartment is smaller than my bedroom in Ohio. I own fewer things than I have owned at any point in my adult life, and I have not once, not a single time, wished I had more of them. What I've noticed instead is how much time I used to spend managing what I owned. Cleaning it, organizing it, repairing it, insuring it, worrying about it. I have more time now. Not just because the days are longer here, in some philosophical sense. Literally more time, because there is less to manage. Comfort has limits. At a certain point, it stops adding to your life and starts taking from it. That's not a sentence I would have believed 10 years ago. I believe it now. The seventh thing I learned was that my definition of success had been built by someone else, and I had never noticed. I was good at my job. I was reliable, showed up early, solved problems quietly, stayed out of the politics as much as I could. When I retired, my supervisor said I was one of the best they'd had in the department. I was proud of that. Still am. But my sense of whether I was doing well in life was always indexed to things I could measure. The balance in the account, whether the house was paid off, whether my kids had graduated college without debt. Those aren't bad things to care about. I still care about them, but they were the whole definition, and they left out most of what actually matters. I remember sitting in a park near the market here one evening, watching a group of men playing chess on a concrete table. They had been there for hours, not rushing, not checking anything, not trying to be somewhere else. And one of them, an older man with white hair and sandals held together with a rubber band, laughed at something his opponent said and slapped the table with real delight. Just absolutely pleased to be exactly where he was. I watched him for a while, and I thought, when was the last time I felt that? When was the last time I was that present, that satisfied, that unworried about what came next? I had checked every box I was supposed to check. I had followed the plan. And somewhere in the following, I had forgotten to ask whether the plan was actually designed for a life I wanted to live. The eighth thing I learned was that most of what I was afraid of never happened. Before I left, I had built up a very detailed picture of the problems I would face. Medical care was my biggest fear. I'm 63, I take medication for blood pressure, and I had spent years in a healthcare system that, whatever its flaws, was familiar to me. The thought of navigating something unknown in a country I barely knew was genuinely frightening. I went to a doctor here 6 weeks after arriving for a routine blood pressure check. I found a clinic not far from where I live. The doctor spoke excellent English, had trained in Manila, and was thorough in a way that felt reassuring rather than rushed. The appointment cost me a fraction of what a comparable visit would have cost in the States, even with my insurance. The medication I take is available here at a cost that still surprises me when I think about what I used to pay. I'm not saying the medical system here is perfect. I'm not saying it's equivalent in every way to what I had access to before. But the gap between my fears and my actual experience was enormous. The same was true of a dozen other things I had worried about. The food situation I had fretted over turned out to be a non-issue. I eat well, sometimes better than I ate before. The loneliness I was afraid of bringing with me turned out to be something the environment here actively worked against. The language barrier I had been warned about has never once been a serious problem. Fear, I've come to understand, isn't unintelligent. It's trying to protect you. But it's not a good researcher. It finds the worst examples and treats them as the average. And if you let it, it will argue you out of things that would be good for you. The ninth thing I learned was about gratitude and why I had been doing it wrong. I had always considered myself a grateful person. I said grace with Patricia at dinner for 30 years. I appreciated what I had, or thought I did. But gratitude, the way I practiced it, was something I reached for in the right moments, after something good happened, around the holidays, when I heard news about someone who had it harder than I did. What I'm talking about now is different. It's not event-triggered. It's more like a way of paying attention. One morning here, maybe 4 months after I arrived, I was sitting on the small balcony outside my apartment. It was early, still cool. I had my coffee. There was a woman on the street below sweeping in front of her gate, the way people here do every morning without fail. Kids were starting to appear on their way to school. A jeepney went by with music playing that I didn't recognize. Nothing about that morning was remarkable. That was exactly the point. I had spent years waiting for life to become what it was supposed to be. I'll relax after this is sorted. I'll enjoy things once the finances stabilize. I'll stop worrying when there's less to worry about. And in the waiting, I missed whole stretches of ordinary mornings that were, I understand now, the actual substance of my life. Gratitude is not a feeling you summon when something good happens. It's a habit of attention. It's choosing to notice what's already there. I'm still learning how to do it, but I'm more awake to my own days now than I have been in a very long time. And that shift, that small daily shift in where I'm pointing my attention, has mattered more than almost anything else. I've told you 8 things. The 9th is the one I want you to sit with. I spent 40 years thinking retirement was a destination, the goal you kept your eye on, the reward for doing the hard part correctly. Work hard enough, long enough, responsibly enough, and someday you would arrive at retirement, and retirement would be the good part. Somewhere in my first year here, I realized I had been wrong about that. Not completely wrong. The financial preparation matters, the planning matters. But retirement is not a destination. It's just a different phase of the same life. And the mistake I made, the mistake I think a lot of people make, is treating the years before retirement as the preparation and the years after as the payoff. The preparation and the payoff aren't separate. They're the same thing. Your life is happening the whole time, all of it. When I moved here, I thought I was trying to solve a budget problem. Cut my expenses, stretch my pension, make the numbers work better. And the numbers do work better, genuinely and significantly. But that's not what changed my life. What changed my life was learning, at 63 years old, that I still had the capacity to be changed. That I hadn't finished becoming whoever I was going to be. That moving somewhere unfamiliar at an age when most people are trying to minimize disruption could actually show me things about myself that decades of familiar routine had kept hidden. My son came to visit 6 months after I moved. He stayed for 2 weeks. He was skeptical when he arrived. I could see it in the way he kept cataloging things: the traffic, the power flickering once during a storm, the roosters that wake us up earlier than either of us would choose. But somewhere in the second week, he relaxed. We ate at a small place near the waterfront one evening, nothing fancy. The kind of spot with plastic chairs and a view that would cost $100 in a nice American restaurant and cost us almost nothing here. And he looked around and said, "Pop, I think I get it now." That was enough for me. I didn't move here to make a statement. I didn't move here to prove anything to anyone. I moved here because I looked at what my life was becoming and decided, slowly and with some fear, that it didn't have to be that. That 63 was not the end of anything. I still call Renee every Sunday. I still miss Patricia in ways that don't have language. I still have bad days, and days when the distance from everything familiar feels heavier than usual. And days when some bureaucratic thing takes 4 times longer than it should, and I sit there laughing at myself, forever thinking this would be seamless. But I also have mornings on the balcony with coffee while the neighborhood wakes up. I have Benny and the other men at the market who saved my spot at the table, even when I missed a few weeks because of a cold. I have the satisfaction of a life that costs significantly less than it did, and feels, somehow, larger. I didn't come here looking for that, but I found it. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. The moment you think your life has already told you everything it has to tell you is probably the moment to look a little harder. I thought I was done being surprised. Turns out I was wrong about that too.